She slept on a station bench for 3 days with her twins, until a quiet cowboy whispered, "Come home." The last bus had left nearly 2 hours ago, but Emily Walker hadn't been waiting for a ride. She sat on the cold metal bench tucked beneath the flickering fluorescent lights of the Amarillo bus station, her arms wrapped tightly around the small bundled figures of her twins, Caleb and Grace. The wind howled through the gaps in the door frames, slipping through like icy fingers to prod at her resolve. She flinched slightly every time it did, but not because of the cold. The cold she could handle. It was the unknown she feared. Emily had been sitting there for 3 nights now. Not continuously, of course. Sometimes she drifted off, head slumped over, arms instinctively tightening around the 2 small bodies in her care. But sleep rarely came, and when it did, it was a fragile, haunted kind of thing. Her children didn't understand why their cribs were gone, why the bedtime stories had stopped, why their world had collapsed into this small space between the bench and her side. They only clung to here, sensing something was terribly wrong. She hadn't meant to end up here, not in Amarillo, not on a bus station bench, not with nothing but a threadbare diaper bag, 3 pacifiers, 2 cracked and 1 missing the rubber, and a bottle of formula she was rationing like it was liquid gold. 3 days ago, she had walked out of the only home she'd known for nearly 8 years, the keys still on the kitchen counter. The back door left slightly ajar, and her phone's location settings turned off. She didn't look back. The sky outside was shifting, moving from deep navy to the kind of bruised purple that signaled another dawn approaching. She hated dawns now. They brought questions from people who passed by with judgment in their eyes, from station attendants who hinted with increasing sharpness that she couldn't linger forever, from herself as she stared at the growing dark. Circles under her eyes reflected in the greasy station window. How had it come to this? She had once been a woman with a plan. She had studied early childhood development in college. She had worked at a daycare center with a patience few others had for toddlers and temper tantrums. She'd met Brian at a barbecue her roommate dragged her to, and for a time, he was her son. He had charm, a quiet way of looking at her, like she was the only person in the room. That light had slowly dimmed, and then it turned off completely, but she had stayed. She stayed for the twins, for the house they bought on Maple Street, for the idea that maybe it was just a phase. But it wasn't a phase. It was a decay, slow and steady, until one morning she realized she no longer recognized the man across the breakfast table or the woman in the mirror. Then came the final blow, a message on his phone, not just flirtation, but love declared to someone else. Her stomach still twisted when she remembered the words. The message wasn't meant for her, but reading it had been like watching her own heart get rewritten in someone else's handwriting. So she had packed a bag. She didn't take much, just essentials for the twins and enough money to buy a one-way ticket out of town. But where to? She hadn't decided. She had stared at the departures board and felt like each city name was another foreign country. Dallas, Albuquerque, Denver. But in the end, she hadn't gotten on any bus at all. Not yet. She didn't want to go back. That part was clear. But moving forward, that was murkier. A door creaked somewhere in the station. Emily turned her head, alert now. A janitor pushed Amop slowly across the floor near the vending machines. No threat, just another person going about their job. She relaxed. "A bit." Caleb stirred against her chest, a soft moan escaping his lips before he settled back into sleep. Grace, the lighter sleeper of the two, grunted and turned her face deeper into her mother's coat. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't praying. She didn't know how to anymore. But she was listening. To herself, to the silence, to the small heartbeat of courage that was keeping her upright. Somewhere beyond the glass walls of the station, the world was spinning on. People were waking up in warm beds. Coffee was brewing. Radios were playing the morning news. Her world, by contrast, had shrunk to one square bench and two sleeping infants and the vague memory of who she used to be. She heard footsteps, boots, this time slow and deliberate, her body tensed, muscles tightening around her children instinctively. Boots came into view briefly, then turned a corner out of sight. She exhaled slowly. Her breath fogged up the window next to her. She drew a circle in the condensation with her finger and then stopped herself, embarrassed by the childish reflex. Noon was watching, but dignity still mattered. Even now, and somewhere deep inside, where the mother and the woman coexisted uneasily, Emily made a decision. She wouldn't go back. Whatever came next, even if it meant more nights on this bench, she would not return to the silence, the betrayal, the empty promises. As the first weak light of morning bled through the glass, she pressed her lips to Caleb's forehead, then Grace's. She wasn't strong because she wanted to be. She was strong because she had no other choice, and far across the station, seated on a bench in shadow, a man in a worn cowboy hat watched quietly, saying nothing. For now, Emily had always been someone who carried silence like a second skin. She wasn't raised to shout her pain or dramatize her wounds. Her mother used to say, "If you cry too loudly, no one will hear you when it really matters." Emily never quite understood what that meant as a child, but now at 29, the weight of it clung to her like humidity before a storm. Her silence had grown roots inside her marriage, winding around every disappointment, every ignored plea for comfort. Every night she lay beside a man who looked through her as if she were already gone. The deterioration didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like a leak in the roof you don't notice until the ceiling caves in. At first there were little things, missed dinners, texts left unread, a kind of emotional distance that couldn't be explained but filled every room. Emily tried to rationalize it. Brian was stressed. The twins were demanding. Maybe she had changed. Maybe she had become too tired, too preoccupied with feedings and diapers to notice the man housed to leave notes in her lunch bag. Then came the financial pressure. Emily lost her job at the daycare when the center shut down abruptly. It wasn't her fault, but that didn't stop the guilt. She applied to every position within a 50-mile radius, sat through interviews where her smile trembled from exhaustion, but nothing stuck. Brian never yelled, never accused, but the way he looked at her changed, as if she were a weight he had once chosen to carry and now regretted. The love in his eyes dimmed like the bulb above their back porch, still burning, but barely. He started staying out later. At first it was work, then it was friends, then it was just not home. She noticed a new cologne she hadn't bought. He kept his phone face down, then eventually password protected. Emily asked once, lightly, not wanting to sound suspicious. "Just privacy," he said with a shrug. "Everyone needs some." She told herself not to spiral. She focused on the children, on the routines that held her together. Bottles, naps, bath time, lullabies. If she kept the house clean, if she smiled, if she stayed soft and accommodating, maybe he would come back to her. Maybe he'd see the effort, the pain behind her quiet. But one evening, while folding laundry in their bedroom, his phone buzzed on the dresser. It was face up this time. A message preview lit the screen. She hadn't meant to look. She told herself she was just checking the time, but her eyes caught the words before she could turn away. "I can't wait to see you again. Last night was perfect." The silence shattered. She stood there, shirt half folded in her hands, her breath caught somewhere between fury and disbelief. The air around her felt thinner. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply picked up the phone and opened the full conversation. What she found wasn't one message, it was a collection. Weeks of exchanges, jokes, pet names, late-night confessions. He had told someone else things he hadn't said to her in years, things she'd begged to hear. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor for a long time. The twins were sleeping. The night was quiet, and for the first time Emily felt herself begin to disappear, not just from Brian's world, but from her own. Who was she now? Not a wife, barely a mother, just a woman who had stayed too long, hoped too much, and lost herself in the process. That night she didn't confront him. She couldn't. She needed time to think, to plan. But something shifted inside her. A part of her that had been waiting for permission to leave finally stood up. She watched Brian come home later, eyes red, smelling like beer and guilt masked under cheap cologne. He didn't look at her. He walked past without a word, like a ghost in his own house. The next morning, she packed quietly. Diapers, formula, 3 changes of clothes for each child, her wallet, the last $200 in cash she had tucked away, a photo of the twins taken last spring, one of the few moments she remembered feeling whole. She left a note, just 3 words scribbled on the back of an old receipt. This is enough. She didn't leave a forwarding address. She turned off location services on her phone. She didn't call her sister, who would have tried to talk her out of it. She didn't even cry when she closed the door behind her. There was no space left for tears. She drove to the nearest bus station, heart pounding, hands shaking on the steering wheel. She bought a one-way ticket out of habit, not knowing if she'd use it. She sat on that bench, not out of desperation, but because for the first time, she had nowhere else to be, no one to lie to, noon to pretend for. And as the cold wrapped itself around her like an old enemy, Emily didn't flinch. She simply held her children closer and stared ahead, into a future she couldn't yet imagine. Behind her, the life she had built was crumbling, brick by brick, under the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. By the 3rd night, the rhythm of the bus station had become a cruel kind of lullaby. Every echo of a suitcase wheel across the tile, every mechanical voice announcing delayed departures, every flicker of the overhead lights etched itself into Emily's bones like a permanent memory. She had stopped checking the clock. Time had become irrelevant, measured now only in feedings, diaper changes, and the fitful cries of her twins. Caleb whimpered in his sleep, his cheeks cold against her chest. While Grace stirred beneath the blanket she had folded, Andre folded, until the fabric began to fray. The station's noise ebbed and flowed, like a tide that never fully receded. During the day there was motion, people, noise, the false sense of purpose that came with the arrival and departure of buses. At night it all quieted, leaving behind only the forgotten. A man slumped in a corner muttering to himself, an old woman who knitted without looking at her hands, a teenager wrapped in a hoodie too big for his frame, eyes scanning every shadow, and Emily, sitting upright as if slouching would make her situation more real. The cold seeped deeper at night. The station's heat was unreliable, and the metal bench under her thighs felt like ice. She used the diaper bag as a footrest to keep her shoes from splitting open, the seams having begun to fray with all the walking. The blanket was thin, not meant for outdoors, let alone for 2 infants. She tucked it tighter around Grace's shoulders, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Kindness came in pieces. A security guard handed her a bottle of water with a glance that lingered a little too long. A woman with a baby carrier passed by and left a small sack of Reed apples on the bench. Emily whispered a thank you too softly for anyone to hear. She rationed the apples, cutting thin slices with the plastic knife from a lunch pack, feeding them one by one to the babies and chewing the skins herself. The twins needed strength more than she did. She'd decided that much. Each hour stretched, longer than the last. Her body ached in places she didn't know could'ish. Her back from the constant tension, her arms from the weight of her children, her chest from the silent war between fear and resolve. The station was not a place made for waiting without end. Every corner reminded her she didn't belong. She felt the stares even when they were subtle. People passed her and then passed again, as if circling around a tragedy too small for headlines but too big to ignore. On the 2nd night, a woman in a bus driver uniform had sat near her for a moment. She didn't speak, but she looked. Really looked. Emily pretended not to notice, pretending was easier. After a few minutes, the woman walked away, leaving behind a pair of hand warmers and a single folded paper napkin. Emily unfolded it later to find a quote written in pencil, "Even the strongest storms run out of rain." It was signed with only a first initial, J. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was more than nothing. By the 3rd night, the exhaustion turned everything surreal. She imagined things, voices, smells, warmth that didn't exist. Once, she thought she saw her mother walking through the station, long coat swaying, arms outstretched, but it was just a stranger with the same walk. Emily shook herself awake over and over, afraid to fall too deeply into sleep. She couldn't afford to miss a cry, a moment, a threat. She was the last line of defense for her children. There was no cavalry, no one coming. She began counting her breaths just to pass the time. Inhale, hold, exhale, wait. Start again. Each cycle, a small protest against panic. She hummed old lullabies when the silence became too loud. Her voice cracked, but the babies settled. That was all that mattered. Somewhere around what felt like midnight, a figure entered her periphery. Not hurried like the travelers, not heavy like the guards. The steps were even, deliberate. Emily didn't look up at first. She'd learned that eye contact invited questions, or worse, pity. But the presence didn't pass by. It lingered. She finally looked up. A man stood several feet away, wearing a cowboy hat so worn it had lost its shape, and boots caked with dust, as if they had walked through another century to reach her. He didn't move closer. He didn't speak. He just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, watching with a kind of stillness that made Emily's skin prickle. She stared back, tense, heart ticking faster. The man's face was hard to read. Not hostile, not exactly kind either, just unreadable. Then without a word he set something on the bench beside her and turned away. She watched as he walked to the far end of the station and sat down on another bench, folding his arms and lowering his head. She glanced at what he had left, a small package of diapers, 2 granola bars, a miniature bottle of hand sanitizer. It wasn't much, but it was everything. She looked back toward him, but he wasn't looking, just sitting, like he hadn't done anything unusual. Emily didn't move for a long time. Finally, she reached for the items, fingers trembling. She placed the diapers gently beside her, like they were made of glass. She opened one granola bar and broke it in thirds, eating one and saving the rest for the twins. The taste was stale but glorious. She chewed slowly, fighting the sting in her throat that wasn't hunger. Something about the man unsettled her, not in a dangerous way, more in the way a mirror unsettles you when you haven't looked in one for days. She wasn't used to being seen without being judged. And though he hadn't said a word, she felt noticed. She told herself not to read into it. People passed through stations all the time. He was probably just another drifter, or a worker on a late shift, or someone else with nowhere to go. He disappeared like the rest. But still, long after he disappeared from view, she could feel the echo of his presence like a pebble dropped into still water. And for the first time in 3 nights, Emily closed her eyes and slept for more than a minute. It was not restful, but it was real. The 4th night in the station began with a dull ache behind Emily's eyes, a tiredness not even sleep could fix. Her body had learned to exist in this half state of alertness, but it wasn't built to endure it for long. Every sound felt louder. Every shift in lighting seemed too bright or too dim. Grace fussed in her arms, her tiny hands cold even inside the blanket, while Caleb had developed a soft cough that hadn't been there the day before. Emily's nerves jumped. With every raspy inhale, she had no thermometer, no medicine, just a mother's instincts and a growing sense of helplessness. She tried not to panic. Panic wasted energy, and energy was in short supply. Outside, the wind howled again. A storm was moving in. One of those dry, bitter Texas nights where the cold cut sharper than the wet chill of northern winters. She adjusted the babies again, tried to layer the few spare items she had to block the draft. The heat vents had gone silent, another silent failure in a place designed only for passing through, not for living. She noticed him again before she saw him, the quiet man with the dusty hat and weather-worn boots. He stood several paces away, just like before, the same stillness about him that made him feel separate from the station's restless rhythm. His presence was jarring in its calm, like a breath held too long. Emily turned her head slowly, her expression guarded, ready to deflect. Questions or offers that came with conditions, but he didn't speak. Not right away. Instead, he stepped forward in deliberate silence and placed something on the bench beside her. Not with a flourish or a pointed look, just a quiet act, unassuming. Then his gaze met hers, steady, unreadable, and he nodded once. This time, it wasn't just supplies. Alongside another granola bar and 2 small juice boxes, there was a sealed pack of baby wipes and a folded piece of paper. Emily didn't reach for it immediately. She waited until he'd stepped back, as if returning to some invisible boundary line only he could see. When she finally opened the paper, she found a short message written in uneven handwriting. "If you're stuck, I got space. Not much, but clean. No name, no number. Just that offer floating between the lines." She read it twice, then again, the words refusing to settle. It wasn't a demand or a rescue wrapped in control. It was something simpler. An invitation with no strings visible, and that alone was terrifying. Emily's first instinct was suspicion. Offers came with expectations. Even kindness often disguised a kind of debt. She had learned this from too many broken conversations, from apologies that led back to silence, from hands that once held hers and then pushed her away. She didn't know this man. She didn't even know his name. Why would he care? Why now? Still, something in his demeanor reminded her of the way her father used to read the paper. Slow, deliberate, without speaking unless it mattered. She hadn't thought of her father in a long time. He'd passed away before the twins were born, long before Brian stopped seeing her. And yet that memory flickered through her mind like a photograph in a box she hadn't opened in years. She stared at the man again. He stood a few feet away, unmoving, not staring, just waiting. Emily clutched the note and whispered something to herself she didn't quite understand. Then she shifted, adjusting Caleb and Grace in her arms, trying to summon words that wouldn't make her sound desperate or afraid. "Why?" she asked softly, unsure if he could hear. He stepped forward slowly, removing his hat with a practiced gesture. His hair was a mess of sun-bleached strands, and his face carried the wear of long days under open skies. "No one should have to sleep where they're not safe," he said. His voice was rough, but not harsh. He glanced toward the twins, especially not the little ones. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak again. "I've got a truck outside, not far, 15 minutes out of town. You can say no." He didn't push her. He didn't offer promises or paint a picture of salvation. Just stood there, giving her space to breathe. Emily looked down at her children. Grace's fingers were curled around the edge of her sleeve. Caleb had gone quiet again, his cough less persistent now, but still present. Her body screamed for warmth, for silence, for a moment to think without the crush of strangers, the fear of being moved along like unwanted baggage. Still, it was a risk, but so was staying. She lifted her gaze again. The man hadn't moved. "Okay," she said, voice hoarse, "just for the night." He nodded once and held out a thermos she hadn't noticed before. "Coffee," he said, "not strong, but warm." Emily took it with one hand, feeling the heat bleed into her palm. She didn't thank him. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because the word felt too fragile in that moment, too small for what it carried. He turned and led the way. She followed, slow, steady, every step calculated. The twins nestled against her, unaware of the choice she had made, of how everything might change, or not change at all. Outside, the wind bit at her cheeks, and the parking lot shimmered under harsh sodium lights. He walked to an old pickup truck parked near the far edge, opened the door without fanfare. The inside smelled of leather and pine. A folded blanket lay across the passenger seat. He moved it without comment. Emily settled in carefully, securing the babies first, then herself. The man slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The truck rumbled to life like a reluctant animal. As they pulled away from the station, the city lights faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by long stretches of darkness and stars smeared across the sky like spilled sugar. She didn't know his name. He hadn't asked hers. But for the first time in days, she wasn't watching shadows. She wasn't listening for footsteps. She was just moving, and sometimes that was enough. The drive was quiet, filled only by the sound of the road beneath the tires and the occasional rattle of something loose in the back of the truck. Emily sat with her hands wrapped tightly around the thermos of lukewarm coffee, its warmth fading with each mile, but still better than nothing. Caleb stirred once or twice in his makeshift carrier on the seat beside her, while Grace slept more soundly than she had in days. The man at the wheel didn't look over. He drove like someone who had done it 1,000 times. One hand on the wheel, eyes steady, posture relaxed. It felt oddly comforting, the stillness of his presence. They passed long stretches of empty land, only occasionally interrupted by a fence or a rusted sign. Amarillo disappeared behind them, like a forgotten shadow, replaced by the darkness of open space. Emily tried to stay alert, her instincts coiled in caution, but the rhythm of the truck, the exhaustion in her limbs, and the subtle warmth of the cabin dulled her fear. She wasn't safe, not yet. But she wasn't alone on a bench in the cold, either. That counted for something. They arrived at the property just after 1 o'clock in the morning. The truck rolled through a gate that creaked on old hinges, and the driveway was more gravel than road. Emily caught glimpses of a barn to the right, a few bales of hay stacked under a lean-to, and a house further ahead, small, wooden, with a porch light that glowed like a lighthouse in the distance. The man parked near the front steps and turned, off the engine. Silence settled between them. He stepped out first, walking around the truck to open her door. Not rushed, not ceremonial, just practical. Emily unbuckled the twins and gathered the bag with stiff fingers. The porch creaked under her weight as she climbed the steps, and the door opened with a sigh of old wood. Inside, the house was plain but tidy. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something warm, beans maybe, or cornbread. Nothing grand, just clean and lived in. "You can have the guest room," he said, nodding toward a hallway on the right. "But, it's got heat. Sheets are fresh." "It's not much." Emily hesitated in the doorway of the room. It was small, a single bed, a dresser, and a rocking chair, but it looked like a palace after the station. She turned back toward him, still unsure of the rules of this strange grace. "I don't know your name," she said finally, her voice rough from disuse. He looked at her for a moment, then shrugged one shoulder. "Cole." Just that. One syllable. Simple as a breath, she nodded. "I'm Emily." He didn't ask questions, didn't press, just offered another nod and added, "Kitchen. Help yourself if you're hungry." "There's stew with that." He disappeared down the hallway opposite hers, his boots thudding softly on the hardwood floor. Emily stood in the doorway for a moment longer, the silence now heavy in a different way. Not threatening, just unfamiliar. She entered the room and set the twins down on the bed, arranging the blanket around them. They stirred but didn't wake. The room's warmth was already making a difference. Caleb's breathing had steadied, and Grace no longer curled into herself. To conserve heat, Emily sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long breath. Her muscles ached in places she hadn't noticed before, and her stomach tightened at the thought of food. She moved to the kitchen, following the faint scent of something savory. The light over the sink was on, casting a golden glow over the wooden counters and the ceramic bowls neatly arranged on the shelves. She found the stew in a pot on the stove, still warm. She poured Asmul bowl, careful not to take too much, and sat at the table. Each bite was a slow revelation. Her body didn't care about seasoning or texture, just that it was hot, filling, real. As she ate, she glanced around the room. Photographs dotted the walls, sepia-toned images of people on horseback, a boy with a dog, a couple smiling in front of a barn. The frames were mismatched, the arrangement imperfect, but there was care in it, a sense of continuity, of history. When she returned to the guest room, she didn't undress, just removed her shoes and lay down next to the twins. The mattress was firm but forgiving. The silence of the house wrapped around her like a second blanket. She stared at the ceiling for a while, half expecting the creaks of a stranger's house to keep her alert. But none came. No footsteps, no voices, no intrusions, just the sound of wind against the windows and the soft, steady breathing of her children. The next morning came gently. Light filtered in through the thin curtains, painting the room in soft gold. Emily blinked slowly, her body reluctant to move. Caleb had turned in his sleep, his tiny hand resting against her side. Grace was still, lips slightly parted, her hair tousled. She rose quietly, checked their diapers, wiped their faces with a damp cloth. There was a basket in the corner with folded towels, a bar of soap and a bottle of baby shampoo. She didn't know who had prepared it, but the thought behind it stung more than it soothed. It had been so long since anyone anticipated her needs. In the kitchen, Cole stood by the stove, flipping something in a pan. He didn't look surprised to see her, just nodded toward the coffee pot, cups in the cabinet. She poured a small amount, unsure of how much was okay. He slid a plate across the counter toward her. 2 eggs, a slice of toast, and a single piece of bacon. Her stomach ached with the smell. "I can't stay long," she said, voice low, unsure why she said it. He didn't look at her when he replied, "Didn't say you had to." Emily sat at the table again, trying to eat slowly, trying not to feel the burn of eyes that weren't watching her, but had seen more than she wanted to admit. She glanced at him once. "Thank you." He didn't nod this time, just said, "You needed a place. I had one. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't charity. It was something harder to define, quieter than most kindnesses she'd known, and that made it stick. Cole. A name not easily forgotten. Not because it was rare, but because it came with no demands. Just space, just quiet, just room to breathe. The days that followed were a careful kind of quiet. Emily never fully unpacked the diaper bag, though she folded the twins' spare clothes and placed them neatly on the small dresser in the guest room. She continued to sleep fully dressed, not out of paranoia, but because the weight of routine gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in weeks. Each morning began the same, Caleb waking first with a soft grunt, Grace a few minutes later with a louder cry. Emily would warm water, wipe their faces, and change them with what little supplies she still had. Cole didn't intrude. He made breakfast most mornings, sometimes with eggs, sometimes just toast and strong coffee. He didn't speak unless it was necessary, and even then his words were sparse. She began to understand his rhythm, feeding the chickens before sunrise, tending to Asmol garden behind the barn, stacking firewood near the porch even though the house had central heating. He worked like someone who had learned long ago that motion was its own kind of survival. Emily felt herself drawn into the cadence of the place. She swept the hallway without being asked. She organized the few toys Cole had in an old wooden crate near the living room, discovering that he had once had nieces or nephews, though he never mentioned them. On the second afternoon, she ventured outside while the twins napped, walking along the edge of the fence, eyes scanning the landscape for a signal. Her phone battery was nearly dead, but even if it weren't, there was no reception out here. That suited her for now. On the third morning, after another quiet breakfast, she asked him, "Is there a bus that runs out this way?" Cole wiped his hands on a dish towel and nodded toward the road, the diner in town. "Once a day. Picks up near." She didn't ask where it went. She didn't need to. Just knowing she could leave if she chose to made the walls feel farther apart. Later that day, she bundled the twins and walked down the long gravel drive to the main road. The town wasn't far, less than 3 miles by her guess, but it felt like another world. There were only a few buildings, a gas station, a post office, and the diner Cole had mentioned, with a faded sign and a porch swing out front. She pushed open the door and was met with warmth, the clatter of dishes, and the smell of grease and coffee. A waitress, no older than 20, offered a tight-lipped smile as she approached. "Need a seat or a phone?" the girl asked, her eyes drifting briefly to the babies. "Neither," Emily said. "Families. I'm looking for the community shelter. Someone told me they take..." The waitress nodded and pointed across the street lately, but you can ask. "Next to the church. They've been full a lot." Emily crossed quickly, holding the twins tighter as the wind picked up. The shelter was in a red brick building with a painted sign that read, "Welcome Center." She stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of soup and sweat. A woman behind a desk glanced up. "Name?" she asked, clipboard in hand. Emily hesitated. "Emily Walker." "I'm not here for tonight. I just want to ask if you have space in the coming days." "I've got 2 children." The woman offered a practiced smile. "Waiting list. Maybe check back next week." "I understand, honey, but we're at capacity." There's Emily nodded, thanked her, and turned to leave. Her heart sank, not because she had counted on staying there, but because part of her had needed the illusion of options. Outside, she sat on a bench near the church and fed Grace from a bottle she had warmed hours earlier. The milk was nearly cold, but Grace drank it greedily. Caleb slept, his head heavy against her shoulder. Emily watched the cars pass by, her fingers tracing patterns on the bottle's surface. This town wasn't hers. This place wasn't home. And yet it was the only place that hadn't turned her away yet. The shelter had no room. The bus station had given her frostbite on her fingertips. Every door she had approached had offered only temporary warmth, followed by the sound of locks clicking shut. She returned to Cole's place just before sunset, her legs aching, her back sore. He was on the porch, sanding a piece of wood with the kind of patience she couldn't imagine having. He didn't ask where she had been, just looked up briefly, then went back to his work. That night, as she rocked Grace to sleep in the chair by the window, Emily thought about the road she was on, not just the physical path, but the one that had started the moment she left the house, with nothing but a diaper bag and a broken heart. She had made choices. She would keep making them. But the world didn't seem interested in giving her more chances. She had hoped the shelter would be her next step, a legitimate path forward. Instead, it was another closed door. She watched Cole through the window as he shut off the barn light and walked back toward the house. His movements were slow but sure, like he had walked this land so many times that even in the dark, he knew exactly where he was. Emily didn't know where she was going. She only knew she wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. The days settled into a pattern that felt almost like breathing. Emily never allowed herself to call it peace, but she could admit it was a kind of stillness she hadn't known in years. On the ranch, time stretched wide. Mornings began with the soft chirping of birds hidden in the trees and the creak of Cole's boots as he moved across the porch before sunrise. He fed the animals before the light had fully crested over the horizon, and Emily often watched from the kitchen window, the twins in their makeshift playpen fashioned from pillows and blankets on the floor. She had learned the layout of the house, instinctively, not through instruction but by paying attention. The pantry was half-stocked but organized, each cannon box lined up with the precision of someone who didn't like surprises. The bathroom was small but clean, the towels always hung neatly, as if even private rituals deserved respect. She never ventured into Cole's room, not out of fear but out of understanding. Some spaces were meant to remain undisturbed. He didn't hover. He offered no explanations for the routines he kept, and he didn't expect any in return. The quiet between them was not cold. It was measured, like an agreement neither had to voice. Most afternoons when the twins napped, Emily swept the floors, wiped down the counters, or took slow walks along the fence line with Grace on her hip and Caleb strapped to her chest. Their ranch was modest, just a few acres surrounded by low hills, a garden still dormant from winter, a small flock of chickens that roamed freely near the barn. But it was maintained with care. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Cole worked, as if the earth owed him nothing, and he asked nothing from it in return. Emily found something calming in that. She wasn't used to people who didn't carry some unspoken debt in their eyes. Cole didn't seem to be hiding anything, which made her feel exposed. She wasn't sure he noticed, or maybe he did and just didn't see the need to say so. One morning, a storm moved through before dawn, brief but fierce. Rain slapped against the windows, thunder cracking like distant artillery. Grace whimpered in her sleep, but Caleb didn't stir. Emily sat up in the dark, watching shadows shift across the ceiling, listening to the storm roll away. When the rain stopped, she opened the window just a few inches. The air smelled clean, heavy with the scent of wet soil and wood. Later that day, she found Cole by the barn, kneeling to fix a broken latch on the chicken coop. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her fingers tapping lightly against her elbow. "Do you ever get tired of all this?" she asked quietly, more to the wind than to him. He didn't look up right away. When he did, his eyes were clear, the color of sand after rain. "No," he said. "It doesn't ask anything of me." Emily didn't reply. She wasn't sure what she'd been expecting. Maybe some shared confession, some glimpse into whatever. Pain had carved the lines into his face. But Cole offered no stories. He simply returned to his task, and after a moment, she walked back toward the house. In the evenings, the quiet deepened. The television was rarely on. Sometimes Cole listened. Tooled records, slow, wordless guitar pieces that felt like soundtracks to invisible memories. Emily didn't ask where he got them or why he played them. She just sat in the living room nursing one of the twins while the music drifted through the house like fog. One night, after putting the babies to sleep, she found herself sitting on the porch steps, a blanket around her shoulders, the stars sharp above her like shattered glass. Cole sat nearby in the rocker, boots crossed at the ankle, a cup of something hot in his hands. She didn't speak, and neither did he, not for a long time. But then, out of the silence, she said, "I left without a plan. I just knew I couldn't stay." Cole didn't move. "I thought about going back a few times," she continued, "not because I wanted to, just because it was familiar, even if it hurt." He took a slow sip from his cup and set it on the railing beside him. "You don't have to explain anything," he said. That stopped her. Not because the words were kind, but because they were true. She stared at the horizon where the hills met the dark, and for a moment she imagined what it would be like to walk toward them and just keep going. But she didn't move, and neither did he. The twins grew quieter at night, their cries fewer, their sleep longer. Emily began to feel pieces of herself returning. Small things, like noticing the way sunlight filtered through the curtains in the late afternoon, or the way Grace liked to tug at her sleeve when hungry instead of crying. She began humming again, soft and tuneless, while folding laundry or rocking Caleb. Not because anyone was listening, but because her voice felt like hers again. Still, there were things she hadn't said. Things she held in the quiet spaces between chores, between meals, between Cole's steady presence and the questions that still circled her mind like wary birds. He never asked why she had left, never asked where she came from or who might be looking for her. That silence should have made her uneasy, but it didn't. She realized that in this house where nothing was demanded, where every word was earned, she was finally breathing without flinching, but she also knew it couldn't last forever, not because of Cole, but because the past never stayed buried. It waited, patient and sure, for the smallest crack to re-emerge, and when it did, she would need to be ready. For now, though, she sat on the porch, her hands wrapped in the blanket, the night pressing ingently around her, and listened as the wind moved through the trees like a whisper with no beginning and no end. The days grew longer, warmer. Grass in. The yard rose higher with each sunrise, and Emily noticed the way the light stayed later, clinging to the porch steps as if reluctant to leave. Spring was unfolding slowly around the ranch, buds on the trees near the fence line, small green shoots poking up from the forgotten garden patch behind the barn. Caleb had started babbling her, testing his voice against the wind. Grace was beginning to pull herself upright with shaky determination. They were growing, absorbing the calm of the place like roots deepening in new soil. Emily, too, found herself settling into something close to rhythm. She no longer jumped at thessalum of a screen door or startled at the creak of wood at night. The fear that had trailed her like a second shadow faded into something quieter, something she could almost ignore. She had started reading again, old paperbacks found in a box near the fireplace. She fed the chickens when Cole was busy, watered the garden with the twins strapped to her side, and even baked once, though the bread came out uneven and dense. Cole had eaten it without comment, just nodded and poured her a second cup of coffee. But quiet isn't permanent, and peace, however gentle, rarely stays untested. It started with a message. A stranger's name lit up the screen of her nearly dead phone, one she hadn't charged in over a week. She didn't recognize the number, but the text was short and immediate. "I know where you are." Her stomach sank. She didn't reply. She turned the phone off and shoved it deep into the bottom of her bag, beneath old receipts, a broken pacifier, and a crumpled onesie with a stain she could never get out. She tried to breathe, tried to make herself believe it was just a bluff, a random threat. But she knew better. Brian had found her. She didn't tell Cole right away. She couldn't. Her throat closed around the truth each time she tried. Instead, she doubled her chores, stayed outside longer, busied her hands with tasks that didn't need doing. The twins sensed it. They clung to her more, especially Caleb, who whimpered in his sleep now and seemed to wake at every sound. Emily started leaving the porch light on all night. One afternoon, as Grace's forehead felt warmer than usual, Emily knew she couldn't wait. Thetown had one clinic, small and understaffed, but it was better than nothing. She strapped the twins into Cole's truck. He didn't argue, only handed her the keys and told her to drive carefully. The clinic was 20 minutes away, just past the same diner and shelter she'd once hoped would have space for her. The waiting room was quiet, sterile. A cartoon rabbit on the wall wore a doctor's coat, smiling above a shelf of outdated magazines. Emily held Grace against her chest, rocking her gently, while Caleb dozed on her lap. A nurse took their information with a tired smile, promised the doctor would be out soon. And then she saw him, Brian. He didn't see her at first. He stood at the far end of the waiting room, talking to the receptionist. His hair was longer than she remembered, pulled back into a low knot. His clothes were sharper, tailored jeans, new boots, but the posture was the same. Casual confidence, wrapped around something sharper. His voice cut through the space and Emily froze. She ducked her head, heart pounding. Her hands gripped the babies tighter. Grace whimpered again, and Caleb stirred. Emily tried to breathe slowly, keeping her gaze down, praying he would leave. But fate isn't always kind. He turned, their eyes met. His face didn't change right away. No gasp, no anger. Just a slow, creeping recognition. A smile that wasn't a smile. Then he took a step toward her. Emily stood quickly, arms tightening around the twins. She didn't speak. She walked, fast, deliberate, toward the exit. "Brian," called after her once, not loudly, not enough to draw attention, but it was enough. She pushed through the door, nearly tripping on the step, and kept walking to the truck. Her hands shook as she buckled the babies in. She didn't cry. Not yet. Cole was outside, fixing the fence near the front gate when she returned. He turned when he heard the truck and walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. Emily didn't get out right away. She sat in the cab, the engine still humming, the weight of what had just happened clinging to her like wet clothes. He opened the door gently. "Something happen?" he asked. She looked at him, eyes wide, and for a moment words failed. Then she spoke, low and broken. "He found me." Cole didn't ask who, he didn't ask how. He just nodded once, then reached into the cab and turned off the engine. Inside the house, Emily told him everything. Not in one breath, not with tears, but piece by piece, like dropping stones into a jar. The coldness that grew in her marriage, the betrayal, the loneliness, the night she left, the nights in the station, the message, the clinic, Brian's eyes. Cole listened without interruption. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his face unreadable but not distant. When she finished, there was silence. Then he said, "You're safe here." It was the way he said it, without drama, without promise of forever. Just a statement, clear and firm. She believed him. For now. But that night, long after the twins had fallen asleep, Emily sat by the window, watching the trees move under the wind. Her phone remained off. Her thoughts did not. The past had found her. Now she had to decide what to do with it. The following days passed under the weight of tension too heavy to ignore. Even as the ranch remained quiet, the wind softer, the chickens clucking in familiar rhythm, Emily's heartbeat with a different cadence, faster, sharper, like the edge of a blade dragged across skin but not yet cutting. She hadn't turned the phone back on. It remained buried in the bottom of her bag, Silenta's stone, but its memory pulsed in her mind with every step she took. She knew Brian wouldn't let go that easily. He had seen her. That changed everything. Cole didn't mention the conversation they'd had in the kitchen that night. He didn't ask questions, didn't suggest a plan, but his presence shifted subtly. He came in earlier from the barn. He checked the lock on the front door twice each evening. He started bringing his tools inside instead of leaving them out on the porch. Small acts, protective but not intrusive. And somehow that made Emily feel safer than any lock ever could. Still, the fear never fully left. It hovered at the edge of everything. Every time the wind made the screen door rattle, every time a car passed on the road, every time Caleb cried out in his sleep. She kept the twins closer now, rarely letting them out of her reach. Grace had developed a cough that wouldn't go away, and Emily didn't trust the clinic anymore. Not after that day. not with the possibility of seeing Brian again. The thought of walking through that door, sitting in that waiting room, no matter how sick her children got, turned her stomach. On the 5th morning after the sighting, Cole found her on the porch, arms wrapped around herself despite the rising sun. "I know someone in the next county," he said quietly. "Runs a private clinic, off the books. Ausetto treat ranchers who couldn't afford insurance. She doesn't ask questions." Emily nodded without hesitation. They drove that afternoon, past the hills, past the broken fence posts and abandoned gas stations, past the stretch of road where dust rose in plumes behind the truck like smoke from something long buried. Cole didn't speak during the ride, and Emily was grateful. The babies slept fitfully in the back seat, and she held her breath each time Grace coughed, counting the seconds between each wheeze. The clinic was small, tucked between a farm supply store and a boarded-up laundromat. It didn't look like much, just a weathered building with a green door and a single window where blinds had been pulled halfway down. But the woman inside, Dr. Marla, had kind eyes and quick hands. She examined Grace gently, checked Caleb too, and scribbled notes in a worn notebook instead of a computer. "Nothing alarming," she said after a long listen with her stethoscope. "Spring colds. Keep them warm, hydrated. I'll give you something. Mild. Should clear up in a few days." Emily exhaled for the first time in hours. Cole paid in cash without comment. They returned to the truck as the sky darkened, a storm gathering far in the distance like a bruise along the horizon. Emily strapped the twins in and paused, her fingers trembling on the buckle. Cole stood beside, the driver's door silent as always, but she could feel his gaze. "I saw him again," she said quietly. Cole nodded once. "He didn't follow me. Not that day, but he could, he might." "You're not alone," he replied. She looked at him then, not just a glance, a real look. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, lines etched deep into his face, stubble he rarely shaved clean, eyes that never rushed. But there was something in the way he stood, still unflinching, present, that made her feel steadier just by being near him. That night, back at the ranch, the storm broke open above them. Rain pounded the roof in thick sheets, lightning slicing the sky into pieces. The twins stirred in their sleep but didn't wake. Emily sat near the window, counting the seconds between each flash and rumble. Cole moved through the house like he always did, closing windows, setting out towels for leaks, checking the generator just in case. When the worst of the rain passed, there was a knock at the front door. Not loud, not rushed, just a slow, deliberate knock. Emily froze. Cole stepped in from the hallway, his expression unreadable. He motioned for her to stay back. The second knock came. Same rhythm, same weight. He opened the door slowly. On the porch stood a woman in a grey coat, her hair plastered to her forehead, a badge clipped to her belt. "Emily Walker?" she asked, peering past Cole into the dim light of the house. Emily stepped forward instinctively. "Yes?" The woman offered a brief professional smile. "I'm with Child Protective Services. We received an anonymous tip about 2 minors possibly living in an unsafe environment. I'd like to ask you a few questions." The words hit harder than thunder. Emily's mouth went dry, her knees wobbled. Cole's voice cut in, low and steady. "You're here without a warrant?" The woman's smile faded slightly. "This is just a preliminary visit." Cole didn't move. "Then you can make it tomorrow, at a decent hour, with proper identification and paperwork, not in the middle of a storm." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You're interfering with a state investigation." "No, ma'am," Cole said. "That's respect. I'm asking for a legal process to be followed. That's not interference." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed, stepped back into the rain and nodded once. "I'll be back," she said. "Don't make me bring an officer." Cole closed the door. Emily stood in silence, one hand braced against the wall. She wanted to scream, but her voice had fled. "She'll come back," she said finally. "She will," Cole agreed. "And if she doesn't like what she sees." He looked at her then, eyes calm. "Then we show her the truth." Emily nodded slowly, her pulse beginning to calm. But the storm hadn't passed. Not really. Outside, the wind had shifted. Inside, everything they'd built, quietly, carefully, now stood on uncertain ground. And the past was no longer knocking. it had stepped through the door. The morning after the knock, the ranch stood quiet under a heavy gray sky. The air smelled of damp earth and something less tangible, unease. Emily moved through the kitchen with a hollow kind of focus, boiling water for oatmeal, wiping the counter twice though it was already clean. The twins played on a blanket in the living room, unaware of the shift in atmosphere. Caleb babbled softly to himself, while Grace banged a wooden spoon against the floor with the kind of curiosity only children carried. Life continued, but with a thread of tension running beneath it. Cole sat at the table, sipping his coffee slowly, watching the doorway. He hadn't said much since the visit from the CPS worker. Neither had Emily. But the silence between them had changed. It wasn't distance, it was preparation. They both knew she would come back. By noon, Emily had cleaned every room in the house. She'd changed the twins twice, brushed Grace's hair gently with the soft bristles of an old baby brush she found in the guest room drawer, and lined up every diaper, every bottle, in precise order. She caught herself rearranging the pantry and stopped, hands trembling. It wasn't about mess, it was about control, about showing something that could not be captured in photos or files, that her children were cared for. That this house, though not hers, had become a shelter, not a hiding place. The knock came again around 2 o'clock. Emily opened the door herself this time. The same woman stood there, hair pulled into a tighter bun, clipboard in hand. Beside her was a man in a brown uniform, a local sheriff from the look of the badge and the slow way he scanned the porch. He didn't speak. "Emily Walker," the woman said, "I'd appreciate your cooperation. As I mentioned, I'm here for a wellness check on the children." Emily stepped aside. Her chest burned with anxiety, but her face remained still. She had learned long ago how to keep emotion locked behind her eyes. The woman entered, eyes moving quickly over the space. Cole stood near the hallway, his presence solid and unmoving. He didn't greet them, didn't offer a seat, just watched. The CPS worker crouched near the twins, who paused their play to stare at the newcomers. Caleb crawled closer to Emily. Grace chewed on her spoon and offered a distracted smile. "They seem healthy," the woman murmured. "May I ask a few questions?" Emily nodded. The questions came in rapid succession. Where had she come from? How long she had been staying here? What relationship she had to Cole? Whether there was an official custody agreement for the children? Whether they had been to a doctor? Recently, Emily answered each one. Truthfully, carefully. She didn't mention Brian by name. She said she'd left an unsafe situation. She said the children had been seen by a licensed doctor just 3 days earlier. She said they were under her care full-time. When the woman asked about Cole's role, he finally spoke. She came to the bus station alone with 2 infants. I saw it. I offered her a safe place to stay, that's it. She's not under duress, she's not hiding. The sheriff scribbled something in a notepad. The woman looked up from her clipboard. "Mr. Cole, have you ever been charged with any form of abuse, neglect, or domestic violence?" "No," he said plainly. "And are there any firearms in the house?" "Yes, locked in a safe. Combinations mine alone." The woman nodded. She walked through the rest of the house, briefly, efficiently, opened the fridge, checked the bathroom, looked inside the twins' room, which Emily had kept pristine. When she returned to the living room, her tone had softened slightly. "I'll file a report. There will be follow-ups, possibly a home study, depending on what the background check turns up. You're not in immediate violation of any statute, Ms. Walker, but your situation is unconventional." Emily nodded. "I understand." The woman turned to Cole. "If you intend to allow them to stay long-term, you may need to consider temporary guardianship filings. At the very least, something that shows legal responsibility in the event of a medical emergency." He didn't respond. They left without further comment. The screen door closed behind them with a quiet snap. Emily stood in the middle of the room for several minutes before sitting down slowly, her body folding into the couch like it had been waiting to collapse all morning. Cole returned to the table and poured another cup of coffee. "They'll come again," he said. "I know. They might take them if they decide I'm not fit or that you're unstable." Emily didn't flinch. "I won't let that happen." He looked at her. "They have more power than we do." She met his eyes. "Then I'll leave." The words came out faster than she expected. Final, clear. Cole didn't respond right away. When he did, it was with a question. "Where would you go?" Emily shook her head. "I'm not fit to be a mother." "I don't know, but I'd rather be alone in a storm than let someone tell me." Cole sipped his coffee. "You're not alone." She knew that, but saying it out loud would make it harder to leave if it came to that. That night, after the twins were asleep, Emily packed a small bag, not because she planned to go, but because she needed to know she could. Diapers, 2 bottles, a change of clothes for each child, and the envelope of cash Cole had quietly left on the nightstand a week ago. She hadn't touched it. Now she folded it into the side pocket. She sat beside the window again, watching the moonlight trace lines across the yard. The house was still, safe. But safety, she had learned, was always conditional. She had made the hardest choice already when she walked away from her old life. But now she faced another: how to protect her children without vanishing again, how to fight without becoming a target, how to trust without surrendering. And somewhere in the shadows of the room, she knew Cole was awake too, waiting, watching, ready. The tension didn't fade overnight, but it began to settle into the walls, no longer clinging to every breath. The CPS visit had left a mark, not a bruise, but a dent in the fragile armor Emily had built around her life since fleeing. The fear was still there, folded between diapers and feeding schedules, buried in the spaces between each measured step. She took across the wooden floor, but there was also something else now. A question, a possibility, one she hadn't dared to entertain in months. Could this place be more than a refuge? The mornings came like clockwork. Cole chopped wood near the pool, shed while mist still hung over the fields. Emily brewed coffee, sometimes before he stepped inside. She no longer waited for permission to belong in the kitchen. The house had begun to memorize her. Her touch smoothed the pillows, her scent lingered in the hallway, her voice, quiet as it was, had become part of its soundscape. Caleb began walking short distances, his steps unsteady, but filled with the pride only a child could wear. Grace followed him with wide eyes, more cautious but no less curious. They laughed more, they cried less, they seemed to understand, without being told, that something was shifting in the air. Emily hadn't unpacked the go bag, but she hadn't touched it either. One afternoon, while the twins napped and the wind pressed softly against the windows, Emily stood on the porch watching Cole hammer a loose board on the fence. The sky behind him was pale blue, streaked with the kind of light that made everything feel clean. She didn't call out, just watched. There was something in his movements, efficient, unhurried, that made her throat tighten. It wasn't attraction, not the kind she remembered from her younger years, when glances sparked like match heads. It was something deeper, a calm tether pulling her back to the world. When he noticed her watching, he paused and wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his back pocket. "Storm coming tomorrow," he said. "Might want to bring in the laundry early." She nodded, arms crossed, a soft smile twitching at the corner of her lips. That night, after the twins were in bed, she found him on the porch again. The stars above were sharp, the night air still. He offered her the other chair with a motion, and she took it without hesitation. They sat in silence for a long while, the kind that only grew between people who didn't need to fill the space with. "Toys? I've been thinking," he said eventually, his voice low. Emily glanced over, waiting. "If you decide to go, I understand. The world's not short on places to get lost in." She looked down at her hands, fingers threading through each other. "But if you don't want to run anymore, there's room here." The words were simple, not dramatic, not even particularly persuasive. But they landed in her chest like a stone dropped into water. She didn't speak immediately. She let the words settle, tried to see them for what they were. An invitation, not a demand, not a favor, just a door opening in the middle of a hallway she thought would never lead anywhere. "Why?" she asked finally. He turned his head, eyes catching the light from the kitchen window. "Because this place was quiet before you came, but it didn't feel alive." She felt the breath catch in her throat. "And I know what it looks like," he added. "See that, and think it's about saving someone. A man offering a woman with 2 kids a roof." "People," Emily shook her head slowly. "You didn't save me." "No, he agreed. "You walked in on your own." They sat together until the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Emily stood, first her blanket slipping from her shoulders, and turned to go inside. At the door she paused and looked back. "Come home," he said softly, almost a whisper. She didn't answer, but the door didn't close behind her for a long time. The next morning, she didn't reach for the go-bag. Instead, she unpacked it. One item at a time, she folded the clothes and placed them in the dresser. The envelope of money she slid into the back of the drawer, not to be forgotten, but no longer kept at arm's reach. She washed the bottles, sterilized them, and lined them up like soldiers ready for inspection. When Cole returned from the barn, she was in the kitchen humming softly, her hands in soapy water. The radio played a song she didn't recognize, but it filled the space between them as naturally as breath. He didn't ask for an answer, and she didn't give one. But when he stepped into the room and set a bag of fresh eggs on the counter, she turned, smiled, and said, "Let's make breakfast." That was how it began, not with fireworks, not with tears, just a choice made in the quiet. A home not promised but offered and accepted, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because, for the first time in a long while, she didn't want to be anywhere else. The first true sign that something had shifted came not in words, but in soil. The patch of earth behind the barn, neglected and overgrown since before Emily's arrival, became a small project, not grand, not planned. Just a corner of the ranch she decided to kneel beside one morning, pulling weeds with bare hands, while Caleb toddled nearby, and Grace played with a wooden spoon she refused to surrender. Cole noticed, of course. He always noticed, but he didn't interrupt. He just brought her a pair of gloves that afternoon, left them on the porch, and said nothing. Spring came fully then, with days that stretched wider and longer, and nights warm. Enough that Emily sometimes left the window cracked open. The wind carried smells of fresh grass and warming dirt. Rain returned in short bursts, followed by sunshine that dried the puddles before dinner. The twins spent more time outside, their laughter echoing off the barn walls like birdsong. Grace learned to stand without help. Caleb chased chickens, tripping. Over his own feet, rising with a giggle that never tired, Emily found herself smiling more. She began working 2 mornings a week at a neighboring farm, only a few hours at a time, while Cole watched the children. The farmer, a soft-spoken widow named Janice, didn't ask questions when Emily showed up with her sleeves rolled and a focused look in her eye. She taught her how to check fences, how to test soil, how to read weather not just by forecast, but bismal and sky. The work was hard, but it grounded Emily. It gave her hands purpose beyond caretaking. It gave her muscles soar in new ways, real ways. Each time she returned to the ranch, the house felt more hers, not legally, not officially. But in the quiet way a space becomes a part of your heartbeat. Cole never said much about her going. He never checked the time or made her feel rushed. He simply looked up from whatever task he was doing when she returned, mending a gate, fixing a tractor, repairing a wire, and nodded as if to say, "You're back, that's enough." He kept his distance in the way a man does who understands space is sacred to those who've had it taken from them. He asked nothing of her, yet offered everything through action, a repaired step on the porch. A coat hung just outside the door the day the wind picked up. The heater already running in the guest room the first night, the temperature dropped unexpectedly. Emily stopped calling it the guest room. One evening, after a long day of digging trenches for irrigation at Janice's, Emily sat on the porch, her feet aching, her back sore, her hair pulled back messily. Grace and Caleb slept soundly in their room, the hum of the monitor faint in the background. Cole brought her a cup of warm cider without being asked, and sat beside her, his boots caked in dirt from his own day of labor. They didn't speak for a while. Then Emily said, "It's strange. I keep thinking the silence will end. That's something. Loud welcome, sirens, shouting, demands, but it never does." Cole stared ahead. "Maybe because this is the kind of silence that stays." She nodded slowly. "I'm still learning not to flinch at it." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. In the following weeks, routines deepened. Emily found she had memorized the rhythm of the ranch without realizing it. The way the sun rose through the eastern window, the soft creak in the third stair, the sound the back door made when it didn't quite close right. She knew where Cole kept the spare keys, how he liked his coffee, that he read the same page of the newspaper twice before moving on. He, in turn, learned the quiet language of her grief. He knew when her silence meant she needed space, and when it meant she needed company. He didn't hover when she stared too long at nothing. He didn't question the night she woke up and stood by the twins' door for no reason. One day, without warning, Emily found herself laughing, not just a chuckle, not a polite smile, but a full-bodied laugh that bent her over, tears prickling her eyes. Caleb had fallen into a bucket while trying to kiss a chicken. Grace clapped as if he'd performed on stage. Emily laughed so hard she had to sit on the grass, and Cole stood nearby, smiling faintly, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. That night she made dinner. She didn't ask permission. She didn't check the clock. She just cooked roasted vegetables, a simple soup, a pie with canned peaches she found in the pantry. When Cole walked in and smelled the kitchen, he didn't speak. He just washed his hands and sat down. They ate without ceremony. Later, as the dishes dried and the twins dozed, Emily leaned against the doorframe, watching Cole stoke the fire. "This isn't what I thought rebuilding would feel like," she said softly. "What did you think it'd feel like? Harder, angrier, like trying to swim against a flood?" He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the flames. "You're not swimming, you're planting." Emily didn't reply. But that night, when she laid her head down, her dreams were full of gardens, not wild and overgrown, but tended, fed, growing, and when morning came, she woke not with dread, but with something else, something close to hope. The months moved quietly, each day stitched to the next with tasks so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone but Emily. A basket of fresh laundry, folded in the late afternoon, a jar of peaches placed carefully on the pantry shelf, a new habit of checking the sky before opening the windows. No announcements, no declarations, just moments, layered one on top of the other, until they formed something that felt solid, something that felt like a life. Caleb had started saying small words, up, more, mama. Grace followed with signs and sounds of her own. They grew like the garden did, stretching toward the sun, fearless, unaware of the storm that once surrounded them. Emily found herself watching them for long stretches of time, marveling not at their resilience, but at how their innocence remained untouched. She had shielded them, and in turn, they had given her something she hadn't expected, a reason to stay. The house, once a place of borrowed shelter, now held the fingerprints of their days. Crayon marks on the baseboards, tiny socks lost between cushions, the smell of warm bread mixed with the sharp tang of soap after bath time. There were still nights when she sat awake, alert to every creak of wood and whisper of wind. But the fear no longer clutched her throat. It waited, yes, but it no longer ruled. Cole remained a constant, orbiting with patience and precision. He offered without asking, he received without taking. They shared meals, stories, and silences that grew more comfortable with time. He never pushed, never filled the room with more than it needed. And yet his presence filled it all the same. A steady warmth, a compass. One Sunday morning, as light spilled across the floor in long golden strips, Emily watched him through the kitchen window. He was fixing a wire near the chicken coop, sleeves rolled, hat pulled low. The children stood at the fence, Caleb pointing, Grace clapping each time a bird flapped its wings. Emily leaned against the sink, her heart slow and steady. She thought about the bench at the bus station, the cold, the silence, the weight of her decision. She remembered the way her body had ached, the way her chest had tightened with each passing stranger. And then she remembered the first time she saw him, just a shadow in a cowboy hat, offering without words, stepping back when she needed space. He hadn't saved her. He had simply seen her. That night, after the children were asleep and the dishes were drying on a towel, Emily stepped onto the porch. The stars were out, thick and bright, scattered like seeds across the dark sky. Cole sat in his usual spot, a cup in hand, boots crossed at the ankle. She sat beside him, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and didn't speak for a long time. Eventually, he turned slightly, his gaze resting on her face. "Been a long road," he said. "It still is," she replied. He nodded. "I didn't think I'd ever find something like this again," she continued. "Not after what I left. I thought peace was something other people got." "You earned it," he said simply. She shook her head. "No, I just survived long enough to be offered a second chance. That's earning it." She looked at him then, not just with gratitude, but with clarity, with the understanding that what they had built wasn't an accident, it wasn't charity, it was choice. "I used to think home was where you started," she said, "where you were born, where you grew up. And now," she looked out over the fields where the fence lines glowed silver in the moonlight. "Now I think home is where someone waits for you, where someone wants you to come back." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, stepped toward the edge of the porch, and turned back. "You belong here, Emily." Her name on his lips was quiet but certain, and when he held out his hand, not to pull her, not to lead her, just to invite, she stood and took it. There were no dramatic gestures, no promises written in the sky, just the firm press of his hand in hers and the understanding that neither of them had to walk alone anymore. Inside, the house waited, dim and warm, the soft sounds of sleep behind the nursery door. Emily didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if the past would try again or if fear would return with sharper teeth. But she knew this: she wouldn't run. Not anymore. Because now, when the world pressed in too close, when the silence grew too deep, she had somewhere to go, and someone who would whisper without hesitation every time, "Come home." That was enough, that was everything.